I don't know if I gave Asef a good fight. I don't think I did. How could I have? That was the first time I'd fought anyone. I had never so much as thrown a punch in my entire life. My memory of the fight with Asef is amazingly vivid in stretches. I remember Asef turning on the music before slipping on his brass knuckles. The prayer rug, the one with the oblong woven Mecca, came loose from the wall at one point and landed on my head. The dust from it made me sneeze. I remember Asef shoving grapes in my face, his snarl all spit-shining teeth, his bloodshot eyes rolling. His turban fell at some point, let loose curls of shoulder-length blonde hair. And the end, of course. That I still see with perfect clarity. I always will. I've been scolded a bunch lately, which is kind of annoying. I got scolded and yelled at in two road rage incidents today. I've been sort of low-key scolded in another sort of weird form. And then I returned a rental car today, and the very short man with a mustache who was sort of tasked with like checking it out, and it probably is the person who has to clean it up, first scolded me for not having my contract, and I went to the office, and then the people there were like, it's fine, you don't need your contract, don't worry about it, we'll print you a receipt. And I went back out there to grab something out of the car, and he walked up to me, and he was like, he pointed into the trunk, and I was like, what, did I leave something in the trunk? And I would say there was maybe like a teaspoon of white beach sand. Like,
oh my God.
I had been using the car to like go paddleboarding and surfing, but I'd vacuumed it out, and he said, next time use a mat. It's nasty. And I was like, what? And he's like, it is nasty for the next person. Next time you rent car, use mat.
And you're like, no, like
I thought you had like vacuum cleaners for this. Like, I mean, I did vacuum it.
Which is amazing. No one does that.
Well, and like when you return it at the airport, like it's like just 1,000 miles of degaff, right? It's just lines and lines of like people like giving their car back, and hundreds of people just like scanning it and being like, have a good day. And then like they're just vacuuming it, they're washing it, there are a million people. But this was at kind of like a downtown small business rental agency. So maybe it's this one guy's job to go through and vacuum all the cars.
And wash the cars.
Right.
Yeah.
But he didn't. Yeah. He did say it's for the next person. Next time you rent car, don't leave it nasty like this. So I wonder if he was Latvian or Hungarian. It was something it actually very much reminded me of the scene in Beverly Hills Cop with I forget the guy's name, Bronson Pinchot or the actor. Serge, who's like the art gallery manager, who is like, button up your shirt. It's not attractive, And Eddie Murphy is like, you're right. It's not attractive. And then they have this hilarious improv about the prices of the art. I see you like this piece right here. I don't know if you remember this scene, but
I've actually never seen Beverly Hills Cop.
Oh, yeah. It's masterful. It's basically like the premise is, in fact, I believe that Sedge is partially inspired by Eddie Murphy's character from.
Oh my God, amazing!
So essentially, like Eddie Murphy's character it's great. It's a great movie. He's from Detroit, and then for whatever reason, a friend of his is murdered by a gangster in Beverly Hills. So he takes some vacation time and goes to Beverly Hills to solve this murder. And then he has several kind of run-ins with the Beverly Hills actual police department, who at first are antagonistic, but eventually they sort of team up and work together. But basically the premise is just like every time he has to infiltrate somewhere, he just improvises a different lie in character, And I mean, that's all the joy. It's just like watching Eddie Murphy go into some club, and he's sort of like, where is Mr. Bagg? I need him to sign for this highly toxic material. It is, and he just comes up with different lies to like get past reception, to the various escalating levels of bad guys and bosses that he's trying to sort of figure out. And so I mean, it's great. And then often the actors, they get to play the various receptionists are also skilled improvisers too.
Nice.
So it's like a cop movie in a mystery with just a lot of like hilarious improv scenes in the middle of it.
That's amazing.
That sort of serve the plot. Yeah.
Is Eddie Murphy known for doing quite a bit of improv during his in his scripts and films?
I'm not sure about improv per se, but he is certainly known for having an incredibly wide array of characters.
Yes,
right.
That's true.
And including like characters of many, many different ethnicities. Like, but yeah, no, I highly recommend Beverly Hills Cop and the sequel. The third one is not supposed to be good. And then they just made a fourth one that I thought was actually pretty good.
Wow.
Too. And I like you, I didn't watch them until 10 years ago or something into my 30s or 40s.
Yeah, it's
because they were sort of like ubiquitous. You'd see it on TV, right?
It's like they're similar to Fletch. Like they show up in syndication in the same way that Fletch does, and you're like, which one is this? Is this Fletch Lives?
Yeah, or the vacation movies. Right?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, you see Eddie Murphy in his like Detroit jacket and his sneakers, like jumping over a wall somewhere into a garden somewhere, and you're like, which one is this? One is it?
And you're like, always very tight jeans, always like awesomely tight, very stylish, acid wash jeans.
It was the kind of jeans that in the 80s, some human being would have had to spend about 6 weeks wearing those jeans at all times.
Yeah.
And like washing them and then letting them dry on their body.
Yeah, to get that exact effect.
To get that exact effect. Now they can kind of make it, although nowadays when you buy jeans and they've been pre-aged, they wear out really, really quickly. Whereas in those days, you had to spend like a solid, 6 weeks aging your jeans. But once they aged in, you had them for like 2 years.
Yeah.
Like they were great. Yeah. The 80s, man.
Yeah, let's talk about this book. I think that's a really, I really approve of that segue. 2003, Khaled Hosseini's debut novel, The Kite Runner. In the first half, we got our narrator Amir's childhood in Afghanistan and the terrible thing he does to his childhood friend Hassan. We move to the U.S. To escape the Russian invasion, and Amir and his father Baba begin trying to assimilate to American life in California. They begin to sell trinkets at a flea shop, and this is where Amir meets his swap meet princess, Soraya Tahiri. And we sort of closed up the last session with them beginning a flirtation, and then Amir's father taking quite ill. So that's the recap of the recap. Do you want to start off with this first half of the second half of the book?
Soraya and Amir do marry, and Baba does die shortly thereafter. And there's a period where Baba, I think, lives with them and is taken care of by Soraya and kind of gets to see his son domestically happy. Soraya and Amir are pretty happy. Mm-hmm. And I would say there's sort of two challenges to their happiness, and one is Soraya's father, the general, is kind of a difficult person, and maybe more difficult to Soraya than Amir, but it weighs on both of them. And then related, Soraya and Amir want children, but seem to be collectively sterile, and we're not exactly sure why. They pass a bunch of tests, and yet they still can't have a baby. Mm-hmm. In the midst of all this, Amir sells the novel that he has been working on. Similarly, I think to Khaled Hosseini, sort of writes a novel, sends it around to some agents. One writes back, says, "I like this, I'll try to sell it for you." 6 months later, they have a book deal in advance. It's like the way these things are supposed to happen and rarely do.
Yeah.
So that's good news. And then, maybe there's more stuff that happens, but my recollection is sort of like 16 years goes by, you know. They're childless. They have a pretty good relationship. The in-laws age. They stay close together. And then Amir hears from his old father's friend, Rahim Khan.
Yeah. Rahim asks Amir to visit him in Pakistan. So we've jumped back to the prologue.
Right.
Basically.
This is the very first thing we read happening.
We do this quick little expositional catch up. Amir learns Hassan got married, had a boy named Sohrab, and then Rahim Khan sort of asks Hassan and his wife to move in with him back into the house where Hassan and Amir grew up together. And then we get the first of our sort of like major reveals / plot twists that Amir's father is also Hassan's father. And had an affair with Hassan's wife. We learn this because Hassan had also tried to have a child.
Ali, Hassan's father.
Sorry. Ali had tried to have a child in a previous, I'm not sure marriage, but a previous
marriage.
Previous marriage.
He was married. A woman left him. He got married again. Mm-hmm. A woman had one kid and left him.
Yeah.
And this is a particularly nasty betrayal on Amir's father's part because Ali and Baba were best friends too, and Rahim Khan has known this for years, and I don't think ever told Hassan, and is only telling Amir this now. So Amir feels very angry and very betrayed by this, but that also makes him realize. Well, the other thing we learn is that Hassan always stayed loyal to Amir. Mm-hmm. Apparently is completely without bitterness. He has passed a letter from Hassan. Hassan has learned how to write, I believe in Dari or Pashto, has written them this beautiful letter about his life. But this is a time where the Taliban are taking over Kabul, and there are tremendous fears about what's going to happen. They disallow kite running. At one point, there's a massacre of Hazara because the Taliban share the general Afghan prejudice against Hazara. And then there's an incident in which Hassan and his wife are both murdered by the Taliban. And this is heartbreaking. Amir has just learned that Hassan, seems to have forgiven him, never doesn't seem at all bitter, but then loses him all at once to this news. But then, of course, that leaves Sohrab, the boy, who Amir now realizes is his nephew.
Right.
And is also his last chance, perhaps, to do something to make up for the way that he betrayed Hassan, first by not intervening when Hassan was attacked and raped, and later by forcing Hassan out of his household because he was overwhelmed by guilt.
So guilty. Yeah.
And so Sohrab is back in Afghanistan and apparently in an orphanage, and Rahim Khan suggests that Amir can go fetch him back and bring him to another orphanage, this one in Pakistan.
Yes, run by a very
it's like Bert and Peggy or something
Peggy,
like that.
Like Shelley Caldwell. They've just like stepped off of the lawn in Kennebunkport or something like that.
The names sound like an invention.
They sure do. They sure do. But Amir does travel.
Betty Caldwell.
That's right, Betty Caldwell.
Yeah.
I think maybe in addition to fantasy name generator,
it's Jim, right? Jim and Betty Caldwell.
Jim and Betty Caldwell. Yeah, like there's instead of fantasy name generator, there's like give me 1960s American white name generator.
They could also be like give me parents of Patricia Highsmith characters.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like
I have no idea where your son Herbie went, Mr. Caldwell.
Do you have that?
The last time I saw him, he was alive and well.
Do you have that dictionary of waspy baby names, babe? I need it.
The waspy baby name dictionary.
I need 2 implausible names for some old white people. No, you only have the 1957, but not the 58 edition. Okay.
And all the female names are either short for Elizabeth or Margaret. Those are the only two. It's like Betty, short for Elizabeth,
Peggy,
meaning purity.
Madeline.
Peggy, short for Margaret. Madeline, short for Margaret. Megan, short for Margaret.
But sometimes also short for Elizabeth.
Betsy,
Eliza.
Short for Elizabeth.
Eliza.
Liz, Lizzie. We only have two names. Our people have two names. Don't tell me that WASP people aren't inventive. Like, to create so many names out of two names is incredibly creative.
Yeah, it's like, there's some sort of like Xeroxing metaphor to come up with here. like they're not actually creating whole cloth. They're just they're slightly modifying and just, it's sort of the Beaker skit from the Muppet Show, but coming up with multiplying names.
Some of them are strange though. Like, where does Peg?
Yeah,
there's no P in Margaret.
I know that's a really weird one. Maggie.
I mean, that's also like Richard
Margaret,
and Dick.
Margot.
Maggie. Yeah, maybe there's some Irish stuff going. Yeah, Margot.
Yep.
Where does
Margot come from? Anyway, so Amir needs to get to Kabul. So he hitches a ride with, at first, a very grumpy driver who, over the course, this is sort of the buddy film subplot for the rest of the movie. We head back towards Afghanistan with this driver who doesn't like Amir at first because he, kind of ran away. We are able to track down Sohrab in the other orphanage in Kabul. The one that Amir's father built has been destroyed by the Taliban. But we discover that Sohrab is not at this orphanage because he has been, quote, purchased from the orphanage by a member of the Taliban. And we understand pretty quickly that purchased for sexual abuse. Sometimes he takes girls, sometimes he takes boys. In this case, he took Sohrab. We get to see a very Handmaid's Tale execution at the halftime of a soccer match, which also feels very Handmaid's Tale-y, this sort of like conflation of horror to a game. We realize who this Talib is that has purchased Sohrab. We don't realize who it is yet, but they meet, and a meeting is arranged, and Amir goes to where he is going to try to make some negotiations with this Talib to get Sohrab back. And who is this particular Talib, Jesse?
None other but Asif, Amir's old tormentor and the man who raped Hassan, the bully, the kind of like German Afghan with blonde hair. So his hair is up in a turban, which is why Amir didn't recognize him. And it's very clear that he's been sexually abusing Sohrab. And Asif, after tormenting Amir in his palace or stronghold or wherever I think it's like a palace of some sort, finally says, yeah, you can go ahead and take Sohrab, but there's going to be a price. This is the same thing he said, some 30 years earlier or 35 years earlier to Hassan. And in this case, the price is they're going to have a fight to the death, which happens. One sense is that if Amir was too cowardly to have the fight, if he were to walk away, perhaps Asif would let him walk away, and maybe that's even what he's hoping will happen. But Amir finally finds the courage to stand up for Hassan, for Hassan's legacy, for this poor boy Sohrab, and they fight. And probably Asif would kill Amir, except for Sohrab, we learn, is just like his father Hassan, a dead shot with a slingshot, and uses the slingshot to wound Asif gravely by shooting a brass ball from the samovar right into his eye, putting his eye out. Exactly what Hassan threatened he would do to Asif, something like 35 years prior to that. The two escape. Asif is left on the floor, like clutching his ruined eye. And Amir is gravely, gravely injured, but the driver smuggles him out of the country to Pakistan, where he is treated in the hospital.
Yep. Sort of comes back to not full health, tells Soraya about Sohrab. She agrees that they should adopt him. Because it turns out, in fact, that Shelley, Betty, Jim,
Betty Caldwell,
Chad,
Betty and Jim
Mike,
Caldwell are complete
and
inventions.
Paul are all totally fake. And Raheem Khan, maybe to duck that little bit of sleight of hand, has disappeared, leaving a note saying that
he's also dying.
He's gravely ill. Yeah, and he says, "I don't want to be found. I want to die alone." Heads off.
And he left $2,000 behind, to sort of settle all this. He also writes a really lovely passage about essentially how Baba, Amir's father's guilt about betraying his friend is what led to all the greatness of his character, too. Which is, it's an interesting moment, especially since Amir has discovered this courage now in protecting the boy. And it also seems to be driven by his guilt to some degree, too. And so we sense that Amir gained some peace around his feelings of anger and betrayal at his father proving to not be the perfect man that he thought he was.
Yeah, there's a real sort of generational doubling here. Amir gets a chance to be guilty but not go to his grave with the guilt. And
there is much doubling.
Yeah, there is much.
Nothing happens once in this book.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's quite neat.
There are no unfulfilled promises. There are no unrecognized threats. There are no unrequited commitments. There are no unreturned betrayals.
Yeah.
Everything is answered.
Yeah, the crochet tapestry of this book is complete. Nothing has been left to the reader to figure out.
Every narrative billiard ball finds a pocket.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the issues, though, is that getting Sohrab home is going to take some time. And Amir kind of floats to him this idea that he's going to put him back in an orphanage while he figures this out. Sohrab is heartbroken about this because you get a very clear
last time
sense.
He was in an orphanage, he got raped.
Yeah. And maybe not just from Asif, maybe from others as well. So he tries to kill himself in a very clear doubling of the INS agent, Raymond something, who is a bit of a dick at first, but turns out to have a daughter that killed herself. And Sohrab survives after Amir does quite a bit of praying to keep him alive. And a visa gets arranged. They go back to the States. Sohrab is quite depressed. And then we get to see the September 11th attacks happen. And the Afghan community of the Bay Area kind of jumps to it to support Afghanistan. And then we close. Sohrab smiles a bit when Amir takes him to fly a kite. And done.
It's wrapped up.
It's all
Not
wrapped
just
up.
fly a kite, but they also engage in a kite fight with somebody else in the Afghan community, and they win the kite fight, and that's the moment that Sohrab smiles.
It would be great if they just attacked somebody else who didn't understand the game like that. I think that would have been awesome.
Just like some random person flying a kite.
Yep. Yeah.
Just like, hey, you know what, kid? Let's go over there and cut their kite.
Yeah. I bet they don't even have glass lining the line of their kite. This is going to be the easiest kite fight of all time.
We did learn that in one of the flashback scenes that when Sohrab was even younger, Hassan, his father, would take him to the kite fights, and they would watch together, and they would run the kites.
And do some
together.
kite running as well.
Yeah.
So you've got a question to kick us off about courage.
Yeah. What is your understanding of the narrative explanation for how Amir finally finds the courage? And the most profound moment is when he stands up to Asif and fights him rather than abandoning Sarab. And there's even a moment where he's being beaten probably to death, and he starts laughing. Yeah. Again, an echo of a story that Asif told him not 2 minutes before. But he's laughing because he has the courage to stand up and that he's free. He's no longer imprisoned by his cowardice. What explanation does the book give for how Mir has affected that personal growth?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think it is the shock of learning about his father's affair and the fact that Hassan is actually his half-brother, which makes the guilt even worse. It's like the guilt has been compounding, like guilt with compound interest. But then like only realizes it now. And then I imagine the guilt sort of like balloons out for Amir. It is a little like he's also, I mean, he's really like taking some chances with the fact that he has, you know, like a wife and a life, like that he is responsible for back in the States. But I mean, I think, you know, this book is, I think we're already hinting at the fact that we are going to probably have some things to say about the like swap in, swap out elements of all the doubling. And that I think that he's been so guilty and he's almost told the story several times. And I think he does tell the story to Soraya. I think he tell her after he tells her after he brings, okay. So that doesn't,
he tells her from Pakistan.
Yeah.
When
so that's
he's in
not,
the hospital.
That's not part of it. But I think also that Rahim Khan's, when he sort of yells at him, and there's enough details about where the guilt really comes through. He sees what's happened to Afghanistan. Afghanistan in a sort of, we talked about the pathetic fallacy the other day. The Afghanistan sort of, you know, is set up to reflect the suffering of its people. We see sort of tear-jerking scene after tear-jerking scene. This family, I think Fahid's family, that feeds Amir, but they really are like, they sort of give up their last food to do so. Like, he's done enough legwork to make Amir's guilt sort of exponentially bigger. And that I think Amir kind of knows that if he doesn't stand up for anything at this point, then he is kind of lost. And I think that's the explanation that the book is trying to give, you know, that like things are really bad and you did a really bad thing and all of your family, you know, sort of knows about it. And all of these other families are kind of doing better than you did. So you better finally stand up to this bully. Yeah.
Do you buy it? Do you think that that's true to human life?
You know, like, this book does a nice job of, there's a sleight of hand that happens through the beauty of the first half and the tension of the first half that I think slides you into this like it's like a suspension bridge of disbelief. You know, it's like a masterwork of suspended disbelief in the second half of the book. So I think by the logic that he has created, then yes, it is acceptable. But as soon as you step back from the book, and, you know, I mean, like, we could jump down to my question about plausibility and do that, because it's basically the same question. Like, do you buy the second half of this book? I think when you start stepping back from it and start realizing, like you said, there's a lot of doubling, everything is really, really neat, that it does begin to kind of pull apart a bit. And I found myself sort of being like, okay, I think I see where this is going. And that's been kind of the thing that's made me kind of come back to this like early aughts group of somewhat confessional, somewhat tear-jerking family, like generational dramas from the early part of this century. that did really well. And, you know, and you're sort of like, I think I see why it did really, really well and why this was turned into a successful movie, because it does have the sort of emotional sleight of hand of a blockbuster movie.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really, really good observation. I also think it's like if we had been reading the beginning of the book and Asif had been about to attack Hassan and Amir had shown courage then, I think we would have gone along with it, right? Because kids are often courageous too. And it's like the book's physics then create this deficit. We've talked about this before. There's a courage deficit, this vacuum that we're just waiting to be filled in. And it's you desperately want, at least I desperately want Amir to find that courage. And it's interesting. I've tried to write moments like this in short stories, and I'm like, how do you create a set of circumstances that give somebody courage? And I think the answer is you can't really. You can only narrate what it feels like when that happens.
Yeah.
And I think there's a passage, and I think you in your answer you put your finger on this first. The passage when Amir is just dealing with the horror of his father's betrayal of Ali and his lying about it. And I pulled a little bit of it right here. How could he have lied to me all those years? To Hassan. He had sat me on his lap when I was little, looked me straight in the eyes and said, there's only one sin, and that is theft. When you tell a lie, you steal someone's right to the truth. Hadn't he said those words to me? And now, 15 years after I buried him, I was learning that Baba had been a thief, and a thief of the worst kind, because the things he'd stolen had been sacred. From me, and the right to know I had a brother, from Hassan, his identity, and from Ali, his honor, his nang, his namus. And then there are a couple paragraphs in which he continues sort of reflecting on this, and then he writes, here's another cliche my creative writing teacher would have scoffed at, like father, like son. But it was true, wasn't it? As it turned out, Baba and I were more alike than I'd ever known. We had both betrayed the people who would have given their lives for us, and with that came this realization that Rahim Khan had summoned me here to atone not just for my sins, but for Baba's too. And I think part of what's happening here is seeing his own anger and disgust at his father's behavior, and then seeing it mirrored in himself. At that point, the guilt becomes intolerable, and it morphs into sort of indomitable responsibility, which is the quality that Amir embodies for the rest of the book, the second half of the book too. And I think I bought that. I think I bought that, like, at a certain point, you reach the point of, I just cannot live with the idea of myself as somebody who's not, who is a thief of the truth. I can't. I'd rather die. And maybe that's not how courage works, but it felt close enough that I went with it for the rest of the book. But I do think you're right that there's a sleight of hand, because it's exactly what the reader wants.
Yeah.
So you don't have, when George McFly knocks out Biff, the only explanation you get is, Crispin Glover's hand curling into a fist and this look of determination coming over him. We don't know why Crispin Glover got the strength to do that in that moment. We just really want him to. Yeah. But I think in this case, I do think there's enough of an explanation. Although it was, it is sort of the central problem of the second, or the central challenge for Amir to overcome the second half of the book. And then he has to overcome several other challenges once he finds the courage too.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, I think it fits with the logic of the novel as it's been presented. And when you are inside this novel under its spell, it works. But then, like, once you do take that step back and you do start seeing, like, oh my gosh, this is, it's sort of like plot armor, but instead of like preserving characters that we know can't die, it's like courage armor.
Well, but here's a thought.
Yeah.
This is a war novel, and it's a refugee novel. And pretty much anybody who survives the kind of war that these people had to survive, and pretty much any refugee who escapes a war like that and creates a new life probably at some point did need to find that level of courage, and probably at some point did need to overcome the sorts of challenges that these characters are facing as well. So, you know, maybe it's more plausible than people whose lives have been as safe as mine and yours can grapple with.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question about, like, where does courage come from? You know, and I think that, like, I think that's probably a question that gets answered uniquely every single time. You know, like, and not just courage in books, like courage in life. And I bet if you interviewed people who do dangerous things, I bet you would get like 20, like for every person. I'm sure there's like a similar shape, but I bet that it sort of occurs in different ways for different people. Like, how do you run into a burning building? How do you go and get somebody back from like a firefight? Like, and like from what I've read accounts of that type, the person is just sort of like, I just did it. You know, like there isn't a thought process, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it clunks a little bit for me, even though, like, I'm not saying I dislike the second half of this book. Again, I think it reads very, very well, but I also think it reads like a debut novel in which, like, there, it feels like there is a desire for the pieces to fit together nicely.
Yes.
And Hosseini has said, like, he hasn't said how he would change it, but he was like, oh, if I was writing that book again, it would be different.
I feel like we're watching somebody go from being a great writer to a great novelist in the span of this novel.
Oh, what an interesting idea.
And because I do like the second half more than the first, even though it has more of the narrative and plausibility that you're alluding to. But I also think it is more chaos, to go back to chaos as a ladder. That there, you know, the physics. Well, actually, this gets to one of the questions I wanted to ask you about, too. I would say the most profound realization of the second half that completely reframes our understanding of the first half of the book is realizing that Baba had an affair with his friend and servant Ali's wife, and, you know, which is a terrible betrayal of their friendship. And also that makes him Hassan's father, which is something he never told Hassan and never told Amir, but explains a lot of the weirdness between Hassan, Amir, and Baba, and explains a lot of what's happening in the first half of the book in a way that it gives it a different light. And there's one moment, too, where, you know, Rahim Khan is explaining this, and he says, you know, if your father was hard on you, it's because he saw a lot of himself in you, and he saw a part of himself that he was ashamed of, you know, and, you know, so I guess I got kind of distracted by that, but where I was going with that is, when do you think that plot point, when do you think Khaled Hosseini was aware of this plot point? Because, you know, I could imagine it being something he knew from the very beginning, or I could imagine it being something he discovered at roughly the same time we, the reader, learn it, because he needs something to get Amir to change.
Yeah.
And we talked about that, right? We talked about that last time. Like, what is going to change Amir? Because we sense there's a redemption arc. The very, like, third sentence of the book is, there's a chance for you to still be good.
Yeah.
Or something like that. So when do you think Khaled Hosseini knows?
I would guess that he knew from the beginning. I just because I do think, even though we do have that wonderful anecdote about him like losing a big chunk of the manuscript and having to rewrite it.
Yep.
And it's too, the book is so tightly plotted, but
that chunk was not very plot heavy, right? Like that chunk is sort of digression, you know?
And that's my question about...
It's kind of the rare digression in the book.
That's my question about tension, but we'll get to that. But I really think that he knew from the get-go. If this were a slightly messier novel, like if it did have some of the like loose ends that I think are really important, then maybe I would agree with you. But I think because it is so tightly narrated and written, I think he knew from the beginning. I would love to ask him. I would love to be like, when did you know that detail from the beginning? I kind of think so, because this book is so much about fathers and brothers that like it kind of, and it's about betrayal. And it's about lying, that if he didn't know it from the beginning, I bet that the first third of the book was heavily rewritten after he discovered it.
Right.
Like something like that. Like maybe he gets to that point in writing and is like, oh.
And then he has to go back and he has to add all those little details that Amir remembers that, you know, should have been clues to Baba's, you know, I wish Hassan was here right now during the graduation, or his father's expression when Hassan's hair lip has been cured in surgery, and several other Hassan, you know, his father's tremendous sense of being upset when Ali and Hassan leave the household, your family, which, you know, that could have been true anyway, you know, because of the sort of feudal relationship that they all have, and the closeness that Ali and Baba have would be enough to make that true. But yeah, he could have gone back and added those details. But I tend to think you're right. I tend to think that this book is a big math problem that Hosseini created first, and then he added all the details. I mean, you know, he probably had a few sketches. You know, here and there, he had a few scenes sketched out, but then he sort of knew the story that he wanted to tell. And, you know, as we observed in the first episode, the physics of the book are perfect, right? And they almost a little too perfect. And they continue to be that way, I think, in the second half.
Talk to me about the tension of the middle third of the novel when we're in America. What is the tension that you located in the middle third of the book?
Oh, that's interesting, because I feel like that's the least tense part of the book. When I saw you had a note about tension, I was like, oh, the tension of the fight, or like the tension of the suicide. I guess the tension of the middle third, you articulated it last time, which was sort of like, where the hell is this going? You know, like it sort of feels like we're done, right?
Yeah.
Now but we know that's not the case, because of the first paragraph tells us that Rahim Khan gets in touch, and there's still a chance you can do good, and because there's unfinished business with Hassan. So we know there's unfinished business with Hassan. Maybe you're getting at the other tension is what the hell's happening with Hassan all this time too. Which you also mentioned last time, and I think that's a really good observation. But I don't know. Maybe you have another answer in mind.
I don't. But maybe my question is more: did you feel tension in the second third of the novel?
No.
Right. Yeah.
No. I know. Not really. It felt very ordinary.
Yeah.
It felt but I guess I felt like I stuck around, A, because we had to tape a podcast, but B, because I knew we were going to get back to the narrative thread. And you know what? I guess I would say I felt some relief in the middle of the novel, because the first third had been so tense that, you know, I guess I felt like, you know, I would just like, can't we just like live life for a little bit and like have normal things like annoying in-laws and, you know, fertility treatment and like that kind of stuff, you know, that people have to go through. I mean, I kind of like that section too, because it was sort of like, you know, it was kind of like all happy families are the same, you know?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly.
He and his wife get along, you know? He's got a nice mother-in-law. He's got kind of an annoying father-in-law. He's got a book deal, you know, like it was, and that I think that's sort of true, right? Yeah. Like that, you know, I happy people I know don't have very interesting lives.
Yeah, it's this wild, like, he manages to keep like a third of a novel aloft on like upper middle class happiness. And like,
yeah,
you know, and like
but he's laying some physical groundwork, right? Because two things I think are really important. And one is Sahara, the wife, is also kind of out of favor with her father because she dishonored, quotes, the family, and by running away with another man and, you know, having sex out of marriage. And, you know, Amir loves her and marries her in spite of this. Her mother is incredibly grateful. I think her father is also grateful, but kind of embarrassed. And so maybe doubles down on, you have to be an Afghan man. And at one point they talk about adoption. And he says, you know, adoption's okay for Americans, but not for Afghans. But we are setting up some things, right? We're setting up that they want kids. Yeah. We're setting up that they can't have kids. Again, we have this mirroring and doubling because Hassan does have a kid.
Yeah.
And, you know, you have two parents with no kid, and then you have two parents with a kid
who are murdered.
The equation's out of the balance, right. So we got to murder
the two
rid
of the parents.
And fortunately, we have the Taliban for that. They'll murder anybody, you know, and like it. And so then the equation comes back into balance. But now the problem is we have parents in United States and we have kid in Afghanistan. So how do we solve that? Well, Rahim Khan, you know, and so like, so that's sort of being set up slowly but surely. But I, you know, I actually kind of appreciated the middle third of the book. I like, you know, I think you've talked about how the reader needs to rest from time to time.
Yeah, and I like I'm not slagging it. It's just it was interesting to me to be like, wow, we're really like supporting a long stretch of pages on like a minor familial, you know, like thing in the scope of what we're dealing with here. You know, like displacement.
He did move us through it pretty quickly, right? Like after the marriage, how many chapters it take for 16 years to go by? It's like 2 chapters, and we do 16 years.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to be like, okay, what's the page count on the on that? But yeah, I mean, I was like, okay, we need some upbeats, and we get some in here. And you're right. Yeah, we are really doing a lot of more plot setup and plot scaffolding for the final third of the book. But you know, I bring it up because like it's another place where we can see like the seams, and the seams are so sort of like watertight. You know, like you know, everything.
I imagine. I don't know. You know, there's what is it? 1,000 Splendid Suns is his next novel. I'm curious to read it. I would imagine that as a writer now, the upbeats would not all be in the middle third. You know, I imagine now that one of the things he's likely learned is we probably should have had more stretches like that in the original third, like the first third, and more action in the middle third. That would be my best guess. That the upbeats and downbeats might be staggered throughout the book. That might be some learning that happened in the course of this novel.
From what I've heard, 1,000 Splendid Suns is the superior book. You know, like the more of his kind of like, and I mean, you know, again, this is like this is very well done. It's a well-made book. You know, it's not, but it's just like it does. It fits perfectly for a movie. Like it reads sort of like the treatment for a big budget Hollywood tearjerker, and that's what we got. You know,
I gotta admit, like it jerks some tears. Like I mean, when we first hear about Hassan being killed, I think we get the details, and interspersed is Amir's internality. No. Yeah. And I was thinking, no, no. And then, before the fight, and also when Amir discovers Sarab in the bathtub, I was wrecked by those scenes. They did their job. I thought, even though I could recognize I could recognize the way I'd been set up for it, and I could see the seams.
Hassan's death was probably the biggest surprise of the book for me. Okay, major spoilers for The Departed, of the a film from almost 20 years ago. When we learn that Hassan gets murdered, and I really like the way that he did that, just like you described, that internality. I had the same, like, oh shit, really? What? Like, we're not going to get a redemption arc that includes Amir and Hassan. It is very, very similar to the moment when Leonardo DiCaprio is just like shot in the back of the head in like a moment in an elevator, and you're like, oh my God, that's our main character. Right. Like, shit. And
that's what you get for not learning the Boston accent, Leo.
Yeah, some assistant producers like,
it's called the T. It's not the subway. Pop, pop, pop. Why are you always texting in your pocket?
It is that's a frustrating moment for me narratively in that movie. But I was surprised in both the film and the book, and that was probably like the moment where I was like, oh shit, like Hosseini's no longer pulling his punches. Yeah.
So that actually brings up one of my questions. You could have a book where the plot is, instead of Sarab being in an orphanage and then being molested by Asif of all people, instead Hassan and his wife are in prison. And instead Amir's quest is to go and get them out of prison, and they reunite. I think that part of Khaled Hosseini's narrative math here is, towards the end, in the final third, there are a couple of moments where Amir is extraordinarily lucky. And I think that Hosseini is a smart enough writer to know that we'll only permit that if there's been a blood sacrifice.
Got it.
And I think just in the same way that Hassan was compared to the sheep being sacrificed in the first third, I think that Hassan and his wife's death are the pain that, this is the Bruce Springsteen body in the ground, that you have to put that. And it was a part of me that's like, I'm not sure how I feel about that. Like, I think that because Hassan is lower class and Hazara, there's some part of me that worries that, like, at some level we accept his sacrifice as more proper. Kind of like if Sam Gamgee had died.
Oh God!
You'd been like, well, that's.
Oh God!
He is the servant after all.
Better book, but my God. Not would it be? I don't know. Ooh, yeah, that would be intense.
But do you hear what I'm getting at here? Is that I think that Hosseini sacrificed Hassan for the sake of allowing, to me, the three big strokes of luck are winning the fight with Asif, the fact that Sarab did not die when he slit his throat, and then eventually getting the visa pretty quickly. Now, all of those have their own accompanying, they have their own blood sacrifice as well. Literally, in the case, Sarab almost bleeds out. Amir is almost killed. His teeth are knocked out. But I think at some level, Hosseini suggests that's not enough. My character is getting away with an awful lot. So we got to have some really bad things happen to him first. But note that I'll say really bad things happening to him.
Yes.
I feel like Hassan dies so that we can understand that really bad things have happened to Amir. And there's some part of me that's like, well, isn't this Hassan's story too? Isn't... So I don't know. I don't know if you have any discomfort around that, but I have a little bit of discomfort around that.
Yeah,
even though it works, right? It hits me right in the gut, and I think it also helps explain Amir's courage in that moment too. I think Hassan's death is one of the motivational forces behind that courage.
This novel passes back and forth over a line of plausibility, like that. And like the best example I can give is like when you go to a horror movie that like when you go see where like Scream does this, like this is the central like tension of Scream is like all of the jokes about the horror movie. Like, so like as Scream points at itself to do that like self-referential thing about like, oh, don't go off by yourself. Don't say I'll be right back. Like there are moments where this book stays on the sort of like well-written novel side of plausibility. And I think you're right that like on that side is like, we need a blood sacrifice. Like we need that. But it also tips over, just like you're saying, into like, okay, why do we need Hassan to do that? We need that to balance the math. We also need it to like bump up the emotional, like things have been sagging for a little bit. You know, we've been off like not being able to have babies in San Francisco. Let's like ramp it back up. Like things are bad in Afghanistan. That like, it's sort of like fan service, except it's like emotional service.
Yeah. I was just thinking, have you seen the movie Punch Drunk Love?
No, I haven't.
So that movie's good.
Okay.
And it's got to be, I think, like maybe Adam Sandler's best performance that I've ever seen. And essentially, the plot's very simple. Adam Sandler falls in love with a woman. They fall in love, and Adam Sandler discovers courage because of that. Simple, but it completely works. And there's a moment, there's a bully character who kind of reminds me of Asif a little bit, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman. And there's this moment that's kind of similar to, except for the stakes are lower. Like probably no one's going to get beaten to death, but there might be, there might be some blows or there might be some intimidation or something like that. And I forget exactly what, but somehow Hoffman's character threatens Emily Watson, who's the wonderful British actress, not Emma Watson, Emily Watson, who Adam Sandler's character falls in love with. And there's this moment where Adam Sandler just turns and he's got this look in his eye and the character immediately backs off. And they could have fought. There could have been a moment where we see Adam Sandler's like newfound strength and courage due to his love, but all he has to do is look at Hoffman and Hoffman gets it. And there was a part of me that sort of feels like as kind of amazing as the fight scene is and the ending with the eye, there was a part of me that was like, what if Amir just walked up to Asif with his brass knuckles and kicked him in the balls?
Yeah.
And then walked out.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, what if he just outsmarts him?
Well,
you know, like,
I mean, it's a little bit like, well, that's a great nunchuck display. You know, it's like,
what if he just smuggled a gun in and shoots him, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, what if, and there was something epic about that fight, and he even pulled that section, but there was, I don't know, I think it's part of what we're getting at here is that I feel like Hosseini is calculating that, like, we know that Asif is terrifying.
Yeah.
So the only way that we can believe that Amir would win the fight would be actually that he is nearly beaten to death. And then, of course, and it was the moment that the slingshot came out, I was like, oh, I didn't see it coming.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
and that is perfectly foreshadowed. And I had even thought the only way he can win this fight is if Sareb somehow intervenes, but that's, of course, impossible. And then there was the slingshot. And then, of course, we already heard that he was a master at the slingshot.
Amazing, even better than his father, yes.
He was even better than his father, and so it is plausible. And in fact, we've also noticed the brass balls just sitting there. The perfect thing to poke out a Talib's eye, right? And so it's all been put together, and it's still satisfyingly not miraculous and satisfyingly foreshadowed. But there still was another part of me that's like, maybe the physics can be off sometimes.
Yeah, there's too much narrative logic. Like there's just... have you ever seen A History of Violence? Yeah. So so A History of Violence has like not quite enough narrative logic, which is what is necessary to power the like... This is a really weird, strange, and like maybe this is the way that violence can sometimes happen. Yeah. Because I feel like the violence in this book is a very Hollywood-esque kind of violence. Yeah. And like there's a few times where it doesn't. There's a moment where a character is like, and my two daughters were like blown up by a landmine, and you're like, fuck. Like, Jesus, that's like, I mean, and that's the like randomness of violence that like is more affecting than this sort of very neatly choreographed violence. And in a very neatly choreographed book. Again, I think the logic, once you're sort of immersed in the magic of this narrative, it works.
But this was the setup of the fight that I thought was interesting. The thing I thought was kind of interesting is that the fight was narrated in the past tense, like through memory. So I'm just going to read that, and you might drop out. But here we go. I don't know if I gave Asif a good fight. I don't think I did. How could I have? That was the first time I'd fought anyone. I had never so much as thrown a punch in my entire life. My memory of the fight with Asif is amazingly vivid in stretches. I remember Asif turning on the music before slipping on his brass knuckles. The prayer rug, the one with the oblong woven Mecca, came loose from the wall at one point and landed on my head. The dust from it made me sneeze. I remember Asif shoving grapes in my face, his snarl all spit-shining teeth, his bloodshot eyes rolling. His turban fell at some point, let loose curls of shoulder-length blonde hair. And the end, of course. That I still see with perfect clarity. I always will. Mostly I remember this, his brass knuckles flashing in the afternoon light, how cold they felt with the first few blows and how quickly they warmed with my blood. Getting thrown against the wall, a nail where a framed picture may have hung once jabbing at my back. Sarab screaming, tabla, harmonium, a dilroba, getting hurled against the wall, the knuckles shattering my jaw, choking on my own teeth, swallowing them, thinking about all the countless hours I'd spent flossing and brushing, getting hurled against the wall, lying on the floor, blood from my split upper lip staining the mauve carpet, pain ripping through my belly, and wondering when I'd be able to breathe again. The sound of my ribs snapping like the tree branches Hassan and I used to break to sword fight like Sinbad in those old movies. Sarab screaming, the side of my face slamming against the corner of the television stand. That snapping sound again, this time just under my left eye. Music, Sarab screaming, fingers grasping my hair, etc., etc., etc. The one thing I found kind of interesting about it is that what he tells us is what he remembers about the fight, and then he says, the ending, of course, I will always remember that, and then he goes on to not tell us how it ends. But I don't know if you have any reflections on just that approach to the fight, which was this kind of stream of consciousness, just images of violence with this interesting foreshadowing of course, I remember the ending, but a good 5 pages where we don't get the ending.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that it's being told in the past tense suggests he survived too.
Yeah, it is an interesting setup because you sort of get the sense that you get the sense that he loses, but you're like, but he's alive. Yeah. Right. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that little, that was, Hosseini's ability for tension in this particular book seems much better in Afghanistan, in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Did the coincidence of Asif being the man in the spectacles, did that stick in your craw a little bit?
Yeah, it did. Although we did have the beggar who was a college professor, and this moment it was foreshadowed that basically Kabul is a small town, and you never know who you're going to run into. Yeah. So yes, it stuck in my craw a little bit. I think part of the problem here is that Khaled Hosseini at times feels like he's writing a very naturalistic novel, like emotional realism. Yeah. And at other time, it feels like he's writing an epic myth of brothers and fathers and sons. Yeah. And I'm not sure he always knows which he wants it to be.
Yeah, it's not tonally inconsistent, but it's sort of thematically inconsistent throughout, and it's not so thematically inconsistent that it renders it, like non-readable or anything like that. But it just, you know what it is it's like this book exists in its own universe. Yeah. And no other universe,
I think if the Talib had not been Asif and had just been, some horrible Taliban guy who played the same role, it would feel more naturalistic. It would feel more like in this world. But something about it being awesome, and the fact that Hassan literally threatens his eye with the slingshot and says, you better back off or they're going to call you one-eyed Asif.
Yeah.
And then 35 years later, his son puts the same... And of course, like, we're getting biblical here, right? Like, it's not a sling, it's a slingshot, but it's David and Goliath, and it's an eye for justice, right? It's not an eye for an eye, it's an eye for a rape, or it's an eye for 2 rapes. But
it is. It's a great yarn. But it never passes beyond the place of yarn, like you really do feel like you can hear the strings swelling, and in the closing pages of the book.
I don't, but there's a part of me that's like, if you went and talked to enough Afghans in San Francisco, you'd find somebody who was like, oh yeah, this is my nephew. I had to go rescue him from this like Nazi Taliban guy, and we poked his eye out in order to escape.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, maybe that did. Maybe that happened to somebody. Like, I mean, and this was what I was getting at refugee stories earlier, that people who survive war zones, these things that seem incredibly far-fetched and coincidental to us, maybe there's more truth to them than we realize.
Well, because I mean, it gets back to the whole idea of that, like the events that are happening out there right now are like fantastically low probability, but something has to happen,
right?
And so, like, and I think the place where this novel stumbles is that there's too many high improbability things that occur. So
and all in service of kind of the mythic, the mythic balancing of every narrative weight, right? That Hassan's son takes his revenge on his father's rapist by doing exactly what his father threatened to do 40 years earlier or 35 years earlier. That happens. All of these things happen in this way. And that's when, you were sort of like, we're not just setting up the chess pieces up. We're sort of making them do aerial ballet, in order to achieve this perfect thing. And so, it loses naturalism. And I think it's okay. It's okay. It's a good story. It's a great novel, I think. But it is... I think there is ultimately a narrative confusion about whether we're doing myth in which you do want perfect narrative physics, right? Like whoever springs from Athena's head better have Athena's quality. Versus a naturalistic, emotionally realistic novel that will have twists and turns, and the narrative physics will be out of balance. Some people will just be unlucky. Some people will be lucky. Some things are just unpredictable.
Right, because
life is weird.
A emotionally realistic novel turns on the sort of like inanities of like human behavior. Those are the that's what you have to put into place to make a emotionally realistic novel work, is that it's like character choice. And in myth, it's never character choice. It's character unchoice is what powers myth. Yeah.
Let's do some trivia.
Okay. I think you were the host. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So in the book, the Ghazi Stadium is a soccer stadium, and it's the site of a horrific public execution by the Taliban in the book. We learned by Asif. This is inspired by a true event. The Taliban did, in fact, conduct at least one public execution in Ghazi Stadium. However, Ghazi Stadium has also been the location of happier occasions. What happier occasion did Ghazi Stadium once host? Hopefully this will be a nice palate cleanser after all of this. Was it A, an exhibition soccer game between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in 1987 to celebrate Reagan and Gorbachev's anti-proliferation treaty? B, a concert by Duke Ellington as part of a State Department tour in the 1950s? C, a demonstration of aeronautics by a group of French aviators, including Antoine de Saint-Exupéry? Or D, a 1/4-mile long diorama of the ring world?
That would be amazing.
Which, if you think about it, a soccer stadium would be great for that.
A perfect place to do that.
Yeah.
Oh boy, I really want it to be number one. I really want it to be A. I want it to be Gorbachev and Reagan palling it up and an Afghan soccer stadium. Duke Ellington.
Eat some kebabs later. These are pretty good.
Mikhail,
what do they call these?
You've got something on your forehead.
No, it is. It's birthmark. Oh, just kidding. It is shawarma sauce. Good joke. Birthmark is on the other side.
Okay.
It's nasty.
Duke, nasty. It's nasty. My birthmark. You're nasty.
You're nasty.
Ronald.
Clean up the shawarma for next driver. Next time you rent kebab.
Your
truck.
name is very difficult to say in Russian mouth. Ronald.
Ronald. Reagan.
Ronald Reagan. Now it just sounds like we're playing Led Zeppelin backwards.
You need the choices again.
Duke Ellington USO Tour was the second one, and I need number C. Number C.
Number C is a demonstration of aeronautics by a group of French aviators, including Antoine de Saint-Exupéry.
What was the date on that one?
I didn't give a date, but it would have to be the early 20th century, I think.
Okay. Duke Ellington, USO Tour, 1950s. What's going on in Afghanistan in the 1950s? What are we doing? We are doing containment, sort of. Let's see, the Soviets invade in 87. Are they still there? They invade in 79. They're still there in 87. Yeah. I'm going to go with the Duke Ellington tour.
You got it.
Oh, it just, they do like the Reagan and Gorbachev is just too wonderful to be true.
It'd be really fun, right? Like,
yeah.
Yeah, I think you would probably know about it if the U.S. and Soviet Union had played an exhibition soccer match in the 80s too. But
yeah, maybe that would be. I'm sure they did, but not in Afghanistan.
We competed with them in the Olympics all the time, but I love the idea of an exhibition soccer match to celebrate an anti-nuclear proliferation
in Afghanistan. Yeah, like
neutral territory.
Oh my God. Hey, where do you want to stage this baseball game? How about Cuba? JFK?
No. How about Afghanistan? They recently, because actually that was shortly after. I think the Soviets had been kicked out by then. The Mujahideen, had been. I don't know the full timeline. We backed the rebels.
Oh yeah, I think they're still. I think it's early. I think it's either right in '89 as the. Did they leave before the Soviet Union collapses or not?
I thought so.
Okay.
It certainly. I mean, but I know I could be wrong.
Yeah,
maybe they were just. It was a military debacle, as was the American incursion into Afghanistan. Again, land wars, Asia. Yeah. Well, anyway, what's your trivia?
Second
time Vinzini has come up in trivia.
I know. I met someone recently who had never seen The Princess Bride.
Oh.
And I was like, oh my God.
I thought you were going to say you met Wally Shawn recently.
Oh my God. Wait until we watch Vanya on 42nd Street and Bill Cosby's next door neighbor is going to get a whole new life for you. Okay.
I once hung out in his girlfriend's apartment. That's my one.
Oh, cool. Interesting. That must. So the Soviet Union has invaded Afghanistan before. Mm-hmm. Was it in 1919, 1929, or 1949? 1919, 1929, and 1949 are your three options.
Right. Okay, 1919 is just after the revolution. I do think that there was probably some territorial expansion going on then, but I think they probably had too much going on. The only like I could imagine like some faction of like the White Russians or something fleeing to Afghanistan and then the Soviets invading to try to catch them. So 1929, sorry, 1919, 1929. I have no idea what was happening in 1929 in the Soviet Union. I just don't think that that's when they would have been invading Afghanistan. 1949 seems more plausible to me that it would have been something that was essentially when they were in the midst of doing territorial expansion and they could get away with it because they had just beaten Hitler. The United States had other problems. So I'm going to go with 1949.
It was 1929.
What?
The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1929 against the Sakhoists, and then again a year later to fight a different, the Basmachi movement. So 1929 was when
the Sakhoists?
I don't know, but we could figure this out. An armed group in Afghanistan who were active from 1924 to 1931. In 1929, they managed to take control of the capital of the Kingdom of Afghanistan, Kabul, reestablishing the Emirate of Afghanistan. Following military reversals in the Afghan Civil War, they were forced out of the capital in October 1929.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, so this is just like, extension of Tsarist policy, and like every Russian leader pretty much since. They like having a sphere of influence. They like all the countries near them to have a government who is friendly to them. That's why, not only like the Soviet Union, they loved that because not only they take over like Ukraine and stuff like that, but they also had like friendly governments in Yugoslavia, Hungary, Poland, Baltics. That's their way. It comes from the psychology of living in a plain with no mountains to protect you. You're just sort of like, well, we need buffers.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that was a good one. You get a ding, I get a buzz.
So, everybody, thanks for listening. Next up, we shift into a series of plays and then a single novel. We are going to be moving next to two of Anton Chekhov's plays, The Cherry Orchard and Uncle Vanya. And then we're going to watch two films of adaptations of those plays, The Cherry Orchard, and then Louis Malle's Vanya on 42nd Street. And then we're going to read Gary Steingart's
Our Country Friends.
Our Country Friends, a 2021 pandemic novel that we both think is going to be very apropos for Chekhov.
So we start with the thing they should read for the next episode is The Cherry Orchard?
Yes, and we'll put it out on Instagram, what translation we're going to go with, and on Twitter. But, you can really read any translation of The Cherry Orchard. But we're going to be using the David Mamet sort of, he went from a literal translation to get his versions and does a really good job of it, I think.
Interesting. And before we do the credits, Chris Bagg, will you read The Kite Runner again?
I don't think so. I think I got it.
Yeah, I hear that. Although I am very, if I ever wanted to read a book for perfect narrative physics, this would be the one. So I could, if I ever wanted to teach sort of structuring the plot of a novel, I think this would be a pretty good choice to go to for that. But I also kind of feel like I got it first time.
Upper Middlebrow is a small point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes can get you over the Khyber Pass for a price. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by me, Chris Bagg. You can learn about us and find our listener survey at uppermiddlebrow.com. And please review us in your podcast app so other people can find the show.
And as a reminder, Chris and I are both writers and editors and can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project, your Khyber Pass, as it were. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, Chris Bagg, ChrisBagg.com, and JesseDukes.com, JesseDukes.com. Good night.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for listening.